The dust was a living thing in the valley, a shroud Jedediah had worn for 2 years. It coated the sills of his silent house, settled in the lines of his face, and tasted of grit and memory. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth of his ranch, a place where joy had once grown as wild as the sagebrush and was now just as desiccated. He rode the fence line not because it needed mending, but because the routine was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. The ghost of his wife, Sarah, her laughter like wind chimes in the cottonwoods. The ghost of his son, Samuel, a tiny babe whose cry had been silenced by a fever that swept through like a prairie fire, leaving nothing but ash. Grief was Jedediah's only companion, a constant, low hum beneath the sound of the wind. He was a man hollowed out, a walking shell moving through the motions of a life that had ended long ago. He stopped his horse, Shadow, at the edge of the dried-up creek bed, a scar running through the land. It was here he'd planned to teach Samuel to skip stones. The thought was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. It was then he heard it. Not the wind, not the cry of a hawk, but a sound so small it was almost lost to the vast, indifferent emptiness. A rustle in the brittle scrub oak. His hand, calloused and sure, went to the rifle in its scabbard. Years of solitude had sharpened his senses. He wasn't a man who startled easily. He slid from the saddle, his boots making no sound on the parched ground. He moved toward the sound, his body a study in grim efficiency. Behind a cluster of rocks, he found them. Not a coyote, not a threat, but something far more dangerous to the frozen stillness of his heart. 3 little girls, huddled together like a litter of abandoned pups. The eldest, maybe 12, had eyes that were ancient pits of defiance and fear. She held a rock in one small, chapped hand, her knuckles white. She stood protectively in front of the other 2. A middle child, perhaps 8, peeked from behind her sister's tattered dress, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with tears. And the smallest, no older than 5, was a bundle of rags with huge, vacant eyes, her thumb plugged into her mouth, her gaze fixed on nothing. They were skeletal, their bones sharp angles beneath their filthy clothes. They smelled of dust and desperation. The eldest girl's chin trembled, but her voice, when it came, was a raw, desperate whisper that cut through Jedediah's carefully constructed silence. "Sir, we're so hungry." The words were not a plea. They were a statement of fact, a truth as stark and brutal as the landscape around them. Jedediah looked past her defiance, past the dirt, and into her eyes. And in their depths, he saw it. A hunger that went beyond the belly. It was a starvation of the soul, a void where safety and love and childhood should have been. It was an emptiness he recognized, for he carried its twin inside himself. The world narrowed to the space between him and these 3 lost souls. The ghosts of Sarah and Samuel whispered at the edge of his hearing, not in judgment, but in sorrow. He saw the logic of the wild, leave them, they were not his problem, he had enough pain to carry. But he also saw 3 children who were on the verge of being consumed by the same wilderness that had consumed his own happiness. He slowly, deliberately, unbuckled his canteen and held it out. The eldest girl flinched, her eyes darting to his hands, to his face, searching for the trick, the price. He set the canteen on the ground and backed away a few steps. "Go on," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She watched him, a hawk studying a snake. After a long moment, she snatched the canteen and gave a short, sharp order to her sisters. They drank, their gulps frantic and loud in the crushing silence. When it was empty, she placed it back on the ground, her gaze never leaving his. He had jerky and hardtack in his saddlebags. He retrieved them, placing them on the ground beside the canteen. He said nothing. He simply watched as they fell upon the food with a ferocity that was painful to witness, shielding their portions with their bodies, eating as if they expected it to be snatched away at any moment. The smallest one, Maya, choked on a piece of jerky, and the middle one, Eliza, thumped her back with a practiced efficiency. The eldest, Leah, watched Jedediah the entire time, her chewing slow and deliberate, a challenge in her eyes. What was he to do? Take them to the sheriff in town? They'd be sent to an orphanage, a place he knew from grim stories was little better than a prison. Leave them here? They'd be dead by sunrise. The hammer of the sun beat down. The ghosts whispered. He looked at the three of them, a ragged, defiant, broken little family, and the ice that had encased his heart for 2 years developed a painful, hairline crack. He made a decision. It was not born of charity or pity. It was born of recognition. He saw his own ruin in their small, frightened faces. He turned and walked back to his horse. For a second, a flicker of despair crossed Leah's face. He was leaving them. Then he returned, leading Shadow by the reins. He looked at Leah, his gaze direct and unwavering. My ranch is a half-day's ride. There's water. There's food. He didn't offer comfort. He offered facts. Leah stared at him, her mind working, weighing the devil she knew against the one she didn't. She looked at Eliza's hopeful face, at Maya's empty eyes. The wilderness offered a certain death. This man, this silent, grieving giant, offered a potential one. It was the only choice she had. She gave a small, sharp nod. Jedediah lifted the smallest one, Maya, and set her in the saddle. She was as light as a bundle of dry sticks and stiffened at his touch, but she did not cry out. He helped Eliza up behind her. He looked at Leah. You can walk alongside. It wasn't a command. It was a statement of what was possible. She looked at her sisters, seated on the big, dark horse, and then back at the man. She nodded again, her face a mask of resolute mistrust. They started the long walk back to the silent house, a strange and broken procession against the stark horizon, a man leading his ghosts, and 3 small girls who had forgotten what it meant to have a home. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in bruised colors of purple and orange, and the shadow of the man and his new, fragile burden stretched long and distorted across the unforgiving land. The house was not a home. It was a museum of sorrow, each room a testament to a life that had ceased. The door creaked open into a space that smelled of cold ash and disuse. To the girls, who had known nothing but ditches and barns for weeks, it was a palace. To Jedediah, it was a tomb he was now forced to share. He watched them from the doorway as they stood clustered together in the center of the main room, 3 small, feral creatures hesitating on the threshold of a foreign world. Maya's wide, haunted eyes traced the outlines of the furniture shrouded in white cloths. Eliza clutched the hem of Leah's dress, her knuckles white. Leah, ever the sentinel, scanned every corner, every shadow, cataloguing potential threats, her body coiled tight as a spring. There were no words. Words were a currency they did not have and he did not wish to spend. Action was the only language that mattered now. He went to the stove, his movements stiff and practiced. He laid a fire, the scrape of the match and the flare of the flame the first signs of life the hearth had seen in 2 years. The girls flinched at the sudden noise. He ignored it. He filled a pot with water from the pump, the rhythmic squeak and splash another intrusion into the profound silence. He found potatoes and onions in the root cellar, a side of bacon hanging in the larder. He worked with a quiet, methodical focus, the simple tasks a shield against the enormity of what he had done. He could feel their eyes on him, tracking his every move. They were like wounded deer, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. When the stew was simmering, filling the cold room with the unfamiliar scent of cooking food, he ladled 3 bowls and set them on the heavy oak table. He placed a spoon beside each bowl. Then he retreated to the far side of the room, turning his back to them, giving them the illusion of privacy as he stared out the window into the encroaching darkness. He heard the scrape of a chair, then another. He heard the soft clink of spoons against ceramic. He did not turn around. He was offering sustenance, not communion. Trust, he knew, could not be forced. It had to be earned, one silent gesture at a time. The first few days passed in this strange, quiet rhythm. He would rise before the sun, do his chores, and leave food on the table. They would eat only after he had left the house. He never tried to speak to them, never invaded their space. He slept in the barn, leaving the house that was filled with Sarah's presence to them. He couldn't bear to be in it with them, these living reminders of the child he had lost. He saw them sometimes from a distance, small figures exploring the edges of the yard, always ready to scurry back inside if he drew too near. He began the task of mending the long stretch of fence along the north pasture, the one he and Sarah had built together. The posts were rotted, the wire rusted and broken. It was a monumental task, a penance. Each post he set, each length of wire he stretched taut, felt like an act of atonement. He was building a barrier, but was he fencing things out or fencing them in? One afternoon, as he worked, he felt a presence. He didn't look up. He continued to wrap the wire, his hand steady. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the eldest, Leah, standing 20 yards away, watching him. She held a half-eaten apple in her hand. She just stood there for the better part of an hour, a silent, judging observer. She was trying to understand him, this man who gave them food and shelter but demanded nothing in return. She was looking for the angle, the hidden cost. Jedediah just kept working, the rhythmic scrape and pull of the wire the only conversation between them. A week turned into 2. The house began to change. The white sheets came off the furniture, folded neatly and placed in a trunk. He found a vase with a fistful of wilting wildflowers on the table one morning. A small, tentative offering from Eliza. He didn't acknowledge it, but he replaced the murky water with fresh from the pump. The most profound change happened in the room that had been Samuel's nursery. Jedediah had not set foot in it since the day he'd carried his son out for the last time. He'd locked the door and thrown the key into the scrub. But Leah was resourceful. She'd picked the lock with a piece of wire. He discovered it by accident, seeing the door ajar one evening. His first instinct was a hot, possessive anger. It was a sacred space. He pushed the door open, his heart a cold stone in his chest. The room was clean, the dust cloths gone. The cradle he had built was empty. But on the floor, beside a small pallet where the 3 of them clearly slept huddled together, was the wooden horse he had carved for Samuel. Its paint was faded, its line simple. And sitting beside it, her small hand stroking its worn, smooth back, was Maya. The little girl who never spoke, who rarely moved, was giving the toy a quiet, concentrated attention that was almost reverence. As she stroked the horse, a single sound, a soft, humming note, escaped her lips. It was not a word, but it was the first sound he had ever heard her make that wasn't a whimper of fear. The anger in his chest dissolved, replaced by an ache so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. They weren't desecrating a memory. They were trying to build a new one. The fragile piece was starting to take root, like a stubborn wildflower pushing through cracked earth. But the world outside the newly mended fences of his ranch had not forgotten them. A rider appeared on the horizon one afternoon, kicking up a plume of official-looking dust. It was Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine was made of paper and whose heart was made of ink. He reined in his horse at the fence line where Jedediah was working. "Jed," Brody said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Heard some strange rumors. Folks in town say you've taken on some strays." The Jedediah didn't stop his work. He pulled the wire taut before answering, his voice flat. "They're children, Brody. Not strays, children without folks. The law has a process for that. County orphanage, they're fine here," Jedediah said, his words a clear dismissal. Brody shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable. "Look, I ain't looking for trouble. But a man passed through last week, a fella named Blackwood. Asked me to keep an eye out for 3 runaway girls. His stepdaughters. Said they were his legal property, got the papers to prove it. Seems he was their guardian after their mother passed." Jedediah finally stopped. He slowly turned to face the sheriff, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. The name Blackwood meant nothing to him, but the phrase "his property" landed like a whip crack. He saw again the look in Leah's eyes, the starvation of the soul. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood, that this was the source. "They ain't property," Jedediah said, his voice dangerously low. Brody held up his hands. "Just telling you what the man said, Jed. He's gone for now, but he said he'd be back. Said he'd have the federal marshal with him next time if he had to. Just be careful." The sheriff tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Jedediah standing in the silence, the fencing tool heavy in his hand. The fragile piece had been a mirage. The wilderness he'd tried to fence out wasn't just the land, it was the world of men. And it was coming for them. The ride back from town was heavy with a silence that was different from the one they had shared before. It was no longer the quiet of unfamiliarity, it was the tense, listening silence of prey that has scented a predator on the wind. Jedediah had taken them for supplies, a risky but necessary venture. He had watched as Leah chose bolts of sturdy cotton, her fingers surprisingly deft. He'd seen Eliza's eyes light up at the sight of a jar of penny candy, a simple joy so foreign it was heartbreaking. He'd even bought a small, clean dress for Maya, who had allowed him to hold it up to her small frame without flinching away. For a few hours, in the anonymity of the general store, they had almost felt like a family. It was a fleeting, dangerous illusion. The illusion had been shattered by the appearance of one man. Silas Blackwood. He had emerged from the saloon, a man whose tailored suit couldn't hide the rot underneath. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp way, with eyes that assessed everything for its value and a smile that never reached them. He had seen the girls, and his smile had widened, a look of smug, chilling ownership. The confrontation had been short, brutal, and public. Well, well. Look what the cat dragged in, Blackwood had said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He'd stepped in front of Jedediah, blocking their path. The girls had frozen. Eliza had whimpered and hidden behind Jedediah's leg. Maya had gone rigid. Leah, however, had stared back at Blackwood, her small face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "They're with me," Jedediah had said, his voice a low rumble. Blackwood had laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Are they now?" "Those are my girls. Wards of the court, placed in my care." Little ingrates ran off on me. He'd looked down at Leah. "You've caused a lot of trouble," Girl Sheriff Brody had materialized then, drawn by the tension. He'd looked from Blackwood's sneering face to Jedediah's granite resolve, and his expression was that of a man who wished he were anywhere else. "They have papers, Jedediah," Brody had said, his voice weak. "He showed them to me." "Guardianship decree, they ain't property," Jedediah had repeated, the words a flat, hard line drawn in the dust. He had moved a step around Blackwood, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol, not as a threat, but as a promise. Blackwood, seeing the look in Jedediah's eyes, had wisely held up his hands in a mocking gesture of peace. "No need for unpleasantness. I see they've fallen under the sway of this rustic Samaritan. I'll be back. With the proper authorities." A federal man who understands the sanctity of a legal document, he tipped his hat and sauntered back toward the saloon, leaving a trail of poison in the air. Now, the ranch that had started to feel like a sanctuary felt like a trap. The mended fences seemed flimsy and inadequate. As Jedediah unsaddled the horses, the girls huddled on the porch, their brief bloom of childhood withered back to the thorny stalks of survival. He could feel their fear, a palpable thing that clung to the evening air. The next few days were a blur of grim preparation. The ranch, once a place he was slowly abandoning to decay, became a fortress. He checked the hinges on every door, the locks on every window. He brought the last of his supplies from the root cellar into the house. He sat at the oak table late into the night, cleaning his rifle and his pistol with a slow, deliberate care. The scent of gun oil mingled with the faint scent of the stew they'd eaten for dinner, a bizarre combination of domesticity and impending violence. The girls watched him, their silence a heavy blanket. The hope that had begun to kindle in their eyes had been extinguished, replaced by the familiar, haunted look of their past. One evening, as he was reloading cartridges, Leah approached the table. She stood for a long moment, just watching his hands. Then she spoke, her voice so low he barely heard it. "You going to sell us again?" The question was a knife, twisted in a wound he hadn't known was still so raw. It wasn't just about Blackwood. It was about every man, every betrayal, every time they had been treated as less than human. He stopped what he was doing and looked up at her. He met her gaze, seeing the profound, deep-seated terror she tried so hard to hide behind her defiant facade. He saw the ghosts of her own past, the specters of abuse and neglect that made trust an impossible dream. He thought of Sarah. He thought of Samuel. He thought of the 2 years he had spent waiting to die, and the last few weeks he had spent, inexplicably, starting to live again. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it filled the entire room. "I ain't selling you. Not now." Not ever. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a desperate desire to believe him. But belief was a luxury she couldn't afford. He made a decision then, a terrible one. He pushed the spare rifle across the table toward her. It was his father's old Winchester, smaller and lighter than his own. "I'm going to show you how this works," he said, his voice even. "Not for you to use. Just so you understand it. So you ain't afraid of it." Fear and shock wore on her face. A weapon was a tool of men who hurt people. But this man was offering to share its secrets. He slowly, patiently, showed her how to check the chamber, how to load the magazine, how to work the lever action. His large, calloused hands were gentle as he guided her small ones. It was a grim lesson, a rite of passage no child should ever have to endure. But in that moment, something shifted between them. He wasn't just giving her knowledge, he was giving her trust. He was treating her not as a child to be protected, but as a partner to be respected. The waiting was the worst part. The sky turned a bruised, angry gray, and the wind began to howl, rattling the windows and moaning through the eaves of the barn. A storm was coming, a physical manifestation of the one descending upon their lives. They were trapped together in the small house, the four of them, a mismatched collection of broken souls bound by a common enemy. Jedediah stood at the window, staring out at the fence line, at the empty horizon. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the shape of a man on a horse. Eliza and Maya were asleep, a tangle of limbs on their pallet, finding oblivion in dreams. But Leah was awake. She sat in a chair by the cold hearth, the old Winchester laid across her lap, her small hands resting on the stock. She wasn't holding it like a toy. She was holding it like a vigil. Then, through the moaning of the wind, he saw it. A movement on the ridge to the east. One rider. Then two. Then four. They were dark silhouettes against the churning, slate-gray sky. Silas Blackwood had kept his promise. He was riding with 3 other men, hired muscle by the look of them. And trailing 100 yards behind, a single, reluctant figure, was Sheriff Brody, the law come to sanctify the atrocity. Jedediah turned from the window. He looked at Leah. Their eyes met across the room. No words were needed. The time for waiting was over. The storm was here. The wind tore at the house, a physical assault that seemed determined to peel the shingles from the roof. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in hard, slanting sheets that blurred the world outside the windows into a gray smear. It was a good thing. The storm was cover. It was chaos. And chaos, Jedediah knew, could be an ally. He moved with a calm that was more terrifying than any rage. He checked the loads in his rifle, then his pistol. He looked at Leah, who was still sitting ramrod straight in her chair, the Winchester held tight. "Stay here. Keep them down. No matter what you hear. You understand me?" She gave a single, sharp nod, her eyes wide but her jaw set. She was no longer just a frightened child, she was a soldier holding her post. Jedediah pulled on his oilskin slicker, slipped out the back door, and melted into the maelstrom. Blackwood and his men had dismounted near the barn, seeking its meager shelter from the deluge. Sheriff Brody remained on his horse, a miserable, sodden statue of institutional indifference. "Jedediah!" Blackwood's voice was a bellow, laced with smug triumph, barely audible over the gale. "There's no sense in this. The law is with me. Just send out the girls, and we can all get out of this miserable weather." Jedediah didn't answer. He was a shadow moving along the fence line, using the noise of the storm to mask the sound of his boots sucking in the mud. He knew this land. Every rock, every dip, every rut. They did not. That was his advantage. One of Blackwood's men, a hulking brute with a nervous tick, grew impatient. He started toward the house, his rifle held loosely. "I'll go drag them out myself," he grumbled. He never made it to the porch. From the darkness near the woodpile, a shot cracked, sharp and clean even in the storm. The man crumpled to the ground, clutching a leg that had suddenly refused to hold him. It was a warning shot, but one delivered with brutal precision. Panic erupted. The remaining two thugs fanned out, firing blindly into the gray curtain of rain. Blackwood swore, diving behind a water trough, his fine suit now soaked in mud and filth. "He's over there," he shrieked, pointing vaguely. But Jedediah was already gone, circling around behind the barn. He moved like a ghost, a vengeful spirit of the land itself. Another shot, this time from the direction of the chicken coop. Another of Blackwood's men went down, a bullet tearing through his shoulder. They were being picked apart, dismantled by an unseen force. Sheriff Brody, seeing the fight turn lethal, finally spurred his horse. "Jedediah, damn it! This is murder," he yelled into the wind. "It was murder when you let him come here," a voice answered from the shadows, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The fight devolved into a desperate, muddy scramble. Jedediah used his knowledge of the ranch, herding them, controlling the engagement. But Blackwood was cunning. While his last remaining man traded wild shots with the phantom in the rain, Blackwood saw his chance. He broke from cover and made a desperate sprint for the house. He was no longer thinking about the law or appearances. His face was a mask of raw, possessive fury. He wanted his property back, and he was going to take it. Jedediah saw the move too late. He was pinned down, unable to get a clean shot without hitting the house. He watched in horror as Blackwood kicked the front door in, the wood splintering inward. Inside, a scream. "Eliza!" The sound propelled Jedediah forward. He abandoned cover, running headlong into the open, a primal roar tearing from his throat. He fired on the run, his bullet taking the last of Blackwood's men in the chest. But Blackwood was already inside. Jedediah burst through the shattered doorway. The scene before him was frozen in time. Eliza and Maya were cowering in a corner. Silas Blackwood had his hand tangled in Leah's hair, dragging her toward the door. Her face was white with pain and terror, but she was fighting, kicking and scratching like a cornered wolverine. In her other hand, she still gripped the heavy Winchester. "I told you were mine," Blackwood snarled, his face twisted. He raised a hand to strike her. In that instant, something broke in Jedediah. The carefully constructed walls around his heart, the ice of his grief, it didn't just crack, it shattered into a million pieces. The man standing before him wasn't just a threat to these children. He was the embodiment of every cruelty, every loss, every darkness that had ever tried to devour the light. This wasn't about the law. It wasn't even about the ranch. It was about the ghost of a baby in an empty cradle and the laughter of a woman on the wind. It was for them. He didn't raise his rifle. He closed the distance in 2 long strides and hit Silas Blackwood with the force of 2 years of repressed agony. It wasn't a fight, it was an exorcism. The 2 men crashed through the table, sending splintered wood and ceramic shards across the floor. It was brutal, close, and desperate. Blackwood was wiry and quick, but Jedediah was fueled by a righteousness he hadn't felt in his life. He felt a sharp pain in his side as Blackwood drew a knife, but he barely registered it. He saw the terror in the girl's eyes. He heard Sarah's voice in his memory, "Protect them." He got his hands around Blackwood's throat, and he squeezed. He squeezed out the smugness, the cruelty, the possessiveness. He squeezed until the light in the man's arrogant eyes finally, blessedly, went out. The silence that followed was more profound than any that had come before. It was broken only by the sound of the rain, the ragged gasps of Jedediah's own breathing, and the soft, terrified whimpers of the children. He slumped against the wall, his side a fiery agony, and looked at what he had done. Sheriff Brody appeared in the doorway, his pistol drawn, his face pale. He took in the scene, the 2 wounded men outside, the body on the floor, the 3 terrified children, and the bleeding rancher who stood over it all like a colossus. He looked at Blackwood's dead, empty eyes. He looked at the knife still clutched in his hand. Brody lowered his pistol. He looked at Jedediah. He resisted arrest, the sheriff said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He drew a weapon. You defended yourself. And your family. He backed out of the doorway. I'll see to the mess outside. The storm began to subside as quickly as it had arrived. The rain softened to a drizzle, and a sliver of pale, watery sunlight broke through the clouds, sending a single beam through the broken doorway. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, and it fell upon the 4 figures in the ruined room. Jedediah slid down the wall, the pain in his side finally making itself known. He looked at the girls. Eliza and Maya were crying, but Leah was just staring at him, her expression unreadable. She walked over to him, her steps hesitant. She looked at the blood seeping through his shirt. Then, she did something that changed everything. She reached out a small, trembling hand and placed it gently on his arm. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. In that one simple touch, a new foundation was laid upon the ruins of the old. The days that followed were quiet and filled with healing. Jedediah's wound was deep but clean. The girls, led by Leah, tended to him with a solemn, gentle gravity. They brought him water. They changed his bandage. They spoke in soft whispers. They were no longer 3 separate, wounded souls. They were a unit. A family. A few weeks later, when Jedediah was back on his feet, he went back to the north pasture. He picked up his tools and looked at the half-mended fence. He turned and saw Leah, Eliza, and Maya standing there, watching him. "Come on," he said, his voice still rough, but with a new warmth underneath. "This fence ain't gonna fix itself." They worked together under the vast, clean sky. Jedediah showed Leah how to stretch the wire. He let Eliza hand him the staples. He even got a small, hesitant smile from Maya when he let her hold the heavy hammer. The ranch was no longer a tomb of memories. The sound of their voices, the tentative laughter, chased the ghosts from the corners. It was a place of life, a place of second chances, a place of becoming. A place where a broken man and 3 lost girls, against all odds, had fenced in a little piece of heaven and called it home. We tell these stories not just to remember the darkness, but to celebrate the light that fights it. If this story of redemption moved you, please let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the human spirit. Click here to see what happens when a lonely farmer finds a mysterious box buried in his field.